Warm welcome you all, sir. Yeah, so I think without much delay, let's set the stage and dive into what's actually driving this change. So the US and India are at different stages of their energy transition journeys, but both are facing growing urgency. What do you see as the most transformative force shaping the future of energy in this corridor, and what role does collaboration play in this? I would like to know all of your perspectives.
You can pass the mic on, and you can use this.
Thank you. How is everybody doing? First of all, thank you so much for having me. I'm a faculty at UC Berkeley, so I'm going to tell you some numbers, and we're going to do some mental math together, okay? And that can essentially kind of show the transformative scale that India's energy sector is going to face over the next 2 or 3 decades. I'm going to tell you 3 numbers, okay? 30, 500, 900. 30, 500, 900. 900 are the number of cars per 1,000 people in the US. 500 are the number of cars per 1,000 people in Germany, Japan, UK, France. Some are 450, some are 550, approximately 500. The countries with some of the most advanced public transportation infrastructure. And 30 are the number of cars per 1,000 people in India. So it really doesn't matter which development pathway India chooses, whether it's public transport heavy, whether it's private transport heavy like the US, a massive growth in the energy consumption is going to happen in India over the next 20, 25 years. And you can tell the same story about power sector, you can tell the same story about air conditioning use, and so on and so forth. So this is where India truly has a unique opportunity. Nearly 70% of the energy infrastructure that will exist in India by 2047, the time when we finish 100 years of our independence, is yet to be built. So there is a huge opportunity to do things right the first time, and this is also the first time in history where environmental sustainability, economic viability, and technical feasibility of our energy solutions are all pointing in the same direction, which is more clean energy focused. And which is where I truly believe India can truly be a leader in the world and in collaboration with the US in clean energy revolution in the world in general. And this is quite different from the US, this is quite different from Europe, this is also quite different from China, where bulk of the infrastructure is already built.
Thanks, Nikit. Hi, everybody. Moving on from a very intense conversation to start the day, we are now talking about 2047, and this panel is about also Viksit Bharat, but we are focusing on the word Viksit. And while we work on the Bharat history and the identity which is fundamental to it, I do think that India and the US are not at the same place in terms of the energy transition. India is an energy deficit infrastructure, 85% still importing our oil, even importing coal. The US is energy surplus in many dimensions. The political and the economic imperatives around the transition are different in the countries, even though both recognize at different levels of political acceptance this is happening. But it is very important to understand how this shapes policy in the country. Let's take the example of India, because I've been there for the last 16 years. The first 10 years before that, I was in the US, which was pre-energy transition conversation. But you see, think about India. If you look at the Indian energy ecosystem, I don't know how many of you know that the most transformative impact on Indian carbon emissions, does anyone have an idea what change in India has done the maximum carbon impact onto the Indian emission landscape? Well, the first step before electrification, the Indian government in 2015 launched what is called the Ujala scheme, Unnat Jyoti by affordable LED for all. And before 2015-14 versus now, India has shifted entirely to LED lighting. That by itself has reduced energy demand for lighting to such an extent that today India saves 4 terawatt hours of electricity demand because it is using LED lighting. In fact, it was one of the key enablers of 100% rural electrification in India, because without incandescent bulbs going to LED, you actually needed much lower electricity and demand on the grid to get electricity to the villages. The current carbon savings, the energy savings of LED bulbs on an annual basis till 2024, may not be true in 25, but until 2024, was actually more than the entire solar output of the country. It was equivalent to taking a 500 megawatt coal plant off the grid. It was equivalent to taking 27 lakh cars off the grid. And this kind of transition, whether it be the Ujala scheme or the another transformational policy, the Ujjwala scheme, which is on the LPG gas, these kind of policy imperatives are much more strongly coming out in India, because the economic imperative, this strategic autonomy imperative is quite more strongly clear, at least at the policy level. As an investor, and I've been an entrepreneur, a builder before, and an investor for some years now, what I see is a lot more technological innovation that is enabling the energy transition to move forward at a pace that every prediction gets beaten, even though we think that we have to move faster, but we still beat every prediction, whether it be on battery technology, whether it be on solar deployment, etc. But the technology progress, that definitely is something that is across the U.S. India corridor, both in terms of innovation as well as deployment and finances. So it is something on which India and US align, though the policy imperatives and clarity is very, very different between the two countries.
If I could just add a bit on that. When you think of the energy infrastructure today in India, compare that to the US, because that's the topic on hand. And compare that to the cellular and the phone technology infrastructure that exists. India really skipped a generation when it came to the phone technology, from wire drawn to a cell phone technology, and then now to the internet technology. The same thing, if you take that and move it to the energy sector, that's what's happening. Till some time back, it was dirty energy, and now suddenly we are talking like what Priyank was talking, or what you were talking about, how the leap has been made from that energy to a solar energy, and also people are talking about lower carbon footprint. So really, that leap has been so predominantly focused, and those are the policies that are coming in place. Now, why do I say that, and how do I relate that back to the US policies? Without getting into the political discussion, which we had a very good discussion, thank you for that, earlier this morning, and without getting into the US politics as well, here we seem to be taking a step back and going back to dirty energy, right? So now, over a period of time, if you go on looking at this differences that would exist between these two energy forms that as countries we focus on, guess who wins in 2047, right? So that's something that as investors we always look for, are long-term gains. And that would be my request here, as well as students who are coming out and saying, how do we build the next Bloom Energy, or how do we build the next Tesla? Think of the long-term gains. Don't think of saying, how do I solve a problem for today, but how do I solve a problem for the next 30 years, 50 years? Sustainable, right? So.
Thank you so much for setting the context so wonderfully well. And I think we also discussed about how India was and how successfully it is doing and would definitely continue to do. It's also equally important to talk about scaling this innovation across borders. And we also have a venture capitalist, we also have an investor and the scientist also on our panel. So it's important to pose this question, like innovation generally often happens in silos. And what do you see as the key enablers for this scalable cross-border innovation between the US and India in both public and private sectors? Also given that public-private partnerships are seen as the vital for scaling clean energy in the current generation.
Now, this may be a little bit a matter of my perspective and my exposure, but while I see people-to-people connections across borders very intensely and in innovation, we see university collaborations like SciPec and other relationships that are there. I think the policy alignments at the government level are not enabling the cross-border collaboration. Now, public-private partnerships in India and the US are doing what they are doing, but there has unfortunately been a direction towards capital boundaries of capital and boundaries now even of innovation. The goal ultimately that the governments have does not seem to be wrong. It's about autonomy, technological self-sufficiency. But I think the isolationist attitude towards that how it's been taken up is creating these difficulties that make it harder for innovation collaborations to happen or capital to move across these boundaries. We have very little ability as an investor fund out of India to invest outside of India. And moving money from outside India to India is also become harder. But on the at the policy level, you do see governments enabling things, whether it is technology transfers, whether it is bringing technology from the West to be deployed and built in India. So there is effort to do that, but it is not necessarily as smooth as it can be at the grassroots level. And so I think the velocity in the cross-border collaboration is, has a lot of speed bumps currently. And I think this is more than what it was even 10 years ago. It has actually increased. The hurdles have gone up.
Good. So, when you think of energy by itself, and you think of cross-border collaboration, it's very easy to say maybe solar energy cross-border innovation and cross-border innovation for the solar industry might be easier compared to nuclear energy. So you have to really put that perspective in and say, at what level are we expecting collaboration to happen today and over the next decade, and so on and so forth. From a policy standpoint, my perspective is really when you think of cross-border collaboration, it could be government-private partnership, like a private entity here with a government entity in India. And if it was to be in the nuclear energy space, might be very, very difficult to execute. However, if it was at a solar panel manufacturing type industry, might be very easy to execute. So it's always good to maybe quantify it in the right lens and then try to move forward. The next step really to that would be to say, as we think of a more porous innovation system, because right now we are sadly, when it comes to the energy field, energy industries, we are really talking of two different big, huge monoliths, right? So I think it takes a while to uncover that. Think of what happened with the IT industry. It took a while before it became so easy to collaborate. So I think to Priyank's point, it's not easy today, but I think if the right intent is there, might come up very, very quickly.
This works. No, I think I generally definitely tend to agree with both of you. So I would kind of broadly characterize this collaboration on 4 different dimensions, right? One is a collaboration on policy. The other is collaboration on technology. The third is collaboration on financing. And fourth, and most important in today's time and age, is more strategic collaboration, particularly on supply chains. And that is critically important, I mean, pun intended, for clean energy industry. And let's analyze one by one, right? Policy collaboration. US has had some incredible success when it comes to clean energy policy for increasing the deployment of solar, wind, and batteries, and so on and so forth, EVs as well. India, on the other hand, especially in the last 10 to 15 years, has had some incredible policy innovation that has led not only to increase in deployment of these clean energy resources, but also a massive reduction in the prices. For example, if you take a solar panel from China, the same solar panel, and if you bring that solar panel to the US and install that solar panel into a solar power plant, and take the same solar panel from China and install it in India, the cost of installing in India is less than half that of installing in the US. Obviously, there's the import cost and the tariffs and so on and so forth doesn't explain any of this cost differential. There is a significant, obviously the cost of labor is low in India, but there are also a lot of policy innovation that India has done. I'll be happy to talk later. That collaboration can happen. And that collaboration, by the way, and that flow of knowledge, it's not going to be from US to India, but that flow of knowledge is actually from India to the US, okay? The second on technology. So there is a good news and a bad news there. For the short to medium term, over the next 5 to 10 years, largely bulk of the technology is already commercialized. There is, for example, batteries, electric vehicles, solar panels, windmills, and so on and so forth. That technology is largely commercialized. The question is really on the long-term technology viability, 20, 30, 40 years down the line. Nuclear fusion, as you rightly said, and several other technologies where you would, green hydrogen, where you would need some technology collaboration between the two. And that flow will be bidirectional, but largely dominated by US technology flowing into India. The third is on finance. I think that is very clear. India has enough finance to support its energy infrastructure, but at the same time, Indian finance is also very expensive at 7%, 8%, 9% interest rate. This is where US finance can play a big role at 5% or 6%. Thankfully, if things go right at 3 or 4%, can eventually finance some of the risky ventures which otherwise may not be financed so well with the Indian financing. And fourth and most important is more strategic collaboration on building the supply chains. Bulk of the battery manufacturing, bulk of solar panels, etc., are still manufactured either in China or by companies that are directly controlled by the Chinese companies. And so this is where a more strategic collaboration, not just between US and India, but also in Quad, like US, Japan, China, US, Japan, India, and Australia, also allied countries like Indonesia that are mineral rich coming together and creating more secure supply chains is also equally important.
Actually, thanks for that segue, Nikit. I just wanted to share some information around the supply chain security and as well as the PPP/policy aspect of that. Today, the world has around 1,100 gigawatts of solar module manufacturing capacity. Now, India has about 80 gigawatts out of that. The US has 40 gigawatts of the module manufacturing capacity. India has about 25 gigawatts of cell manufacturing capacity. So the US has very little of that. But you have to recognize that this has come from a time when, even when I was putting solar on rooftops for various industries and institutions, and I did about 7 megawatts of that, everything came from China. So today, India has about 5% of the world capacity, hugely enabled by the PLI schemes and the government support and the various non-tariff barriers that were implemented to support Indian manufacturing capacity. The US has gone to 40, 50 gigawatts significantly in the last 2-3 years, highly supported by the Inflation Reduction Act. I mean, of course, it's an acronym for what they really did differently. But the point is that the supply chain security has happened at the module stage to a certain level. I mean, 80 gigawatts in India is more than annual installations in India. So it needs export markets like the US and Europe. Europe has hardly any manufacturing capacity on panels. But the cells are still, India does not have enough for itself. And then the wafers are like practically non-existent outside of China as of today. Like 97% is in China. But there, on the wafer side, India doesn't even have the fundamental skills and infrastructure which the US has thanks to its semiconductor background. So you can see various codependency opportunities, partnership opportunities, which are creating security in supply chains, autonomy in supply chains, and also scale that allows the energy infrastructure to move forward in future. One aspect on the nuclear side, which I did want to say to what Rohit referred to, I think that is an area where, due to various concerns, we have boundaries and difficulty in collaborating. But I personally hope and wish that is the place where India and the US find a way to collaborate. Because the SMR development, which can be led out of the US, will be one of the ways to create a new clean baseload capacity that the world needs for all our electrification that's coming on ahead in the future. A lot more to be done there, but that's what I look for in the next 10 years.
I'm sorry, just one additional point, and 100% agree with you what Priyank you said. So 2024, by the way, is a historic landmark year where the renewable capacity addition in India was almost at par with the renewable capacity addition in the US, despite all the policy and the subsidy and the Inflation Reduction Act and other support that the US renewable developers get. Indian renewable developers and Indian governments achieve this almost the same level of capacity addition in the renewable sector than that the US achieved. And India currently ranks number 3 or number 4, depending on which year and how you cross-section it, in terms of renewable capacity additions globally. So Indian renewable capacity additions are bigger than even European capacity additions, which are always touted as one of the most strongest proponents of renewable energy.
Okay. I think this would be my last segment of question. We talked about what is driving the change, about collaboration, about scaling up, and it would be wrong if we definitely didn't touch upon making it accessible to every sections of the society. So laying that foundations for a just transition. So what are the most critical policy reforms or market mechanisms needed today to accelerate a just and inclusive energy transition in both the countries? And how do we ensure rural and even the underserved communities benefit too?
I don't want to get into the underserved and so on, because that becomes a big political debate by itself, right? But however, if you keep that aside and say, how do we serve India, the largest population base, and how can US be a partner in that? Maybe I take that question and answer it as such, in saying that from an investment standpoint, like was already said, there's such a big, tremendous opportunity to invest, not only as from a manufacturing or supply chain standpoint, but from an overall innovation standpoint. One is to say, how do we really decrease the last mile for energy served? And energy served today, when you talk to a common person on the street, right, in India, what do they need energy for? Electricity and to cook food, predominantly, right? However, as you go up the value chain in the society, the energy needs are different, right? Like Priyank started off with cars, or like you started off as well, right? So how do you really encompass that? And I think that's a big opportunity for the US investors, US companies, to have a ready market. How do you enable that? And that should really answer your question, is at a policy level, that is something that I think is still a big barrier. Not from an innovation level, not from an investment standpoint. It's only the, okay, we got 5 minutes, I'll turn it over. I can go on.
Okay, so yeah, thanks a lot for this question. And I think it's very fundamental, important. I'll go back to the scheme I referred to in the beginning, not the Ujala scheme, but the Ujjwala scheme. So in India today, there are about 300 million households, 325 million households using LPG cylinders or LPG gas for cooking, LPG/PNG put together, piped natural gas or liquefied petroleum gas cylinders. Out of this 325 million, around 100 million were actually enabled by the Ujjwala scheme by the government in 2018. The Ujjwala scheme basically gives a free cylinder to these households in the country, and that scheme by itself increased LPG gas consumption in India by 20%. Why is this important? It's a win-win-win-win, I don't know how many win situation. You have ladies in these rural households who are cooking with fuel wood from the forests, so they had to spend time to collect the fuel wood. They were suffering under the pollution in their chulhas. The country was, we are estimated to about 1 lakh annual deaths attributable to such cooking pollution in India. Deforestation, 1.5 million hectares of deforestation attributed to fuel wood. Pollution, You had, life of the ladies in the household spent collecting fuel wood and cooking, no time left for themselves. Just by increasing the LPG consumption, the total gas-based cooking in India increased by 20%. This, if you totally eliminate it, is expected to can potentially reduce Indian greenhouse gas carbon dioxide emissions by 200 million tons. It's not going electric, it's just going to LPG. But going from biofuels to LPG, 200 million tons of carbon dioxide emissions, some estimate even go up to 300 million tons, can be removed just by going fully gas-based. Currently, with this change, we probably have reached an estimated 60% gas-based cooking, from which was around 45–50% earlier. So this kind of a change becomes a just transition enabler. But then the technology and ventures and finance are what is required to scale it further. There are ventures I have seen which are bringing ideas like these households who have what is called the PMUI scheme households, 100 million households, they can't pay the 900 rupees or the 500 rupees for the cylinder upfront. That upfront money is a problem. So why don't we sachetize it like we do the small 10 rupee shampoo and find ways to do that so that people can buy it more easily and take their consumption of energy from around 4 kgs per year to 8 kgs, which is a more normal. And that by itself will reduce biofuel demand. So the innovation can be in this side, in the financial side, on the business model side, but can also be in other ways to get either solar cooking or other adoption happen in the country. Combined with things like the solar rooftop subsidy that the government introduced recently that has accelerated the rooftop adoption, rooftop solar adoption in the country, that is direct subsidy. And India has less than 15% of its solar power being done on rooftops. Most of it being utility scale, because utility scale, you are selling to the grid, you're having a business model through various, various government schemes and scaling that has become economically self-sustaining. The developers don't need a subsidy anymore. They're selling electricity. I sold electricity at 4 rupees to the buyers versus the grid being for 8 rupees or something like that. But the households, adopting them, getting them to adopt in the remote places, having solar power, where it is not viable for a builder or a developer to do electricity, that can be a government transition or a enabled movement of the grid system. And just to close on this, one of the things that I feel very encouraged by, one of the new policies that the government has come out with, Indian government is now through its SECI, which is the Solar Energy Corporation of India, they were the ones who started reverse auction sales of solar grid, where they created demand and developers offered electricity at lower and lower rates per unit of electricity. Now they're offering tenders which say, I don't want just solar, I want 24-hour power. You take solar, you take wind, you take battery storage, you do whatever you want. You build the technology stack, I give you the market demand. And instead of paying 3 rupees, I'll pay 4.5 rupees or 5 rupees, but or whatever lowest you bid. But what that is creating, and I hope it will enable, is adoption of battery energy storage to counter the intermittent nature of solar and wind and to create more stable grid supply of electricity. I've had calls from companies which are what would be medium-sized companies, people who are doing different types of businesses, maybe battery components, now saying, oh, I can make lithium batteries for BESS, how do I do this business? And so when the market demand gets created by policy enablement, then the innovation can follow behind it. And that's where the technology and the finance and the policy all work together to create magic. The change, when it happens much faster, and I don't know how many times this has been said, but we always overestimate the change in the short term, but always underestimate the change in the long term.
Sir, if you could be concise, and then we can discuss more on the roundtable.
Yes. So I think I'll just focus on the just transitions part of it, because just transitions essentially implies potential losses in jobs in the fossil fuel industry, say in states like Odisha, Jharkhand, and so on and so forth. And that creates some deep political economic issues. This is where India has a unique advantage because of the pace of growth of energy demand. Most of the existing fossil fuel losses in the country will not be lost by 2035. So India has that 10-year runway to plan for that transition. And of course, because of the kind of energy investments one needs, those potential job losses could also be absorbed in other forms of energy investments beyond 2035 or so. And second point is technology essentially has enabled deep cost reductions. So one can still have, for example, those coal power plants operating as babysitting assets. We are not really, see, retirement doesn't mean death, right? So we essentially treat those old coal power plants as our grandparents. They would essentially take care of the grid when new kids on the block, such as solar and wind, are essentially not generating, not producing. You still have coal power plants as backup, and there is still a place for coexistence, which is truly the mantra of India's existence as well, of all sources of energy going forward, at least for the next 25 to 30 years.
Thank you so much. I think we have time for just one question, and it's a question, not a comment. Yeah, go ahead.
Hi, my name is Naman. This question is largely for Professor Abhyankar and for the panel as well. But any conversation around sustainability tends to anchor on the supply side. We tend to forget the demand. And this is also coming from your interview recently with NDTV about appliance efficiencies in India. Where do we stand in terms of making efficient appliances in India for the world? And what will drive some of those policy changes that are required for the companies to start taking efficiency seriously in India?
Energy efficiency is the cheapest form of energy, right? So let me begin by saying that. So I think India, unfortunately, does lag in terms of using its energy most efficiently. And that is because of several reasons. So I believe there are three things that really need to happen. One, the role of government policy is absolutely critical in making sure all the energy efficiency standards, et cetera, are up to date and to the global level. Second is there has to be significant consumer adoption as well. And consumer adoption can range, can result in multiple, can be a result of multiple things, but the most important driver for consumer adoption is a quality product, and this is exactly what Tesla did. So if the product gives you the same quality, then people will adopt that product, not because of efficiency, but because how good that product is. And third, and most important, is how industries, for example, respond to this challenge as well.
So I'll just add to that with an example, right? The Ujala scheme is an example of efficiency. We went from heaters that often to end of throwing light, which is incandescent bulbs, to LEDs. But another example is like in air conditioning. The second largest demand source in the country, or the fastest growing demand source in the country, particularly in a tropical place like India. So ISHRE, or Indian Society for Heating, Refrigeration and Air Conditioning Engineers, which I have happened to be part of, they've brought together new policies to building codes in the country for building efficiency, as well as 5-star or 4-star labeling for energy efficiency of air conditioning systems. But the difficulty that also needs to be understood is everyday decisions of people are not driven by moral goals, right? They're driven by economics. So we need to translate the total cost ownership advantages of efficiency into benefits to the consumers that are realized. In India, as Nikit also referred, cost of capital is much higher. India is a capital-starved country. So there are very high level of rate of discounting for future benefits. So that discounts down pretty quickly, and people are much more looking at immediate benefits. Plus, there's also an initial capacity to pay question. So I believe there is some opportunity to think about policy support where you change the way the payment or the cash flow moves for the individual, where maybe he pays less for the energy efficient appliance upfront, but gets the energy savings payout for the appliance, and then over time gets benefit, or some other such ways to increase adoption of energy efficient appliances. For example, in air conditioning, where you have now 4-star, 5-star appliances, but when I try to buy, I see the price difference and I see why people don't buy them as much as the government would like it. Of course, the information is now come in, and certification has come in, which is good, but the adoption needs to be supported in ways to address the particular dynamics of the Indian consumer or the Indian customer that the government is trying to get them to buy this stuff.
Thank you so much. We are running late, and you can ask more questions at the roundtables. And I would take this opportunity to thank our distinguished panelists for inspiring us with their expertise, and also for all the audience for your participation in such a relevant dialogue. And yeah, I would also take this moment to say that not all of us have to be technologically highly sound or intellectually professional to build that connection, to protect, conserve, or preserve our environment. All it takes is just trying to be more, better, ecologically conscious every day, every moment as a human being. So thank you. And